Starting. All right, so we are live for our first. I'm just going to mute you if you don't mind for a moment. Let's see, Jordan. Okay, there we go. All right, just to make sure that everyone can hear me nice, loud, and clear. So we are online. I am Leanne Wynn, reporting from New Jersey, actually, at the present moment, here for Sharks for Kids for another Google Hangout. And today, we have a special guest, Dr. George Lauder, who since 1999 has been professor of organismic and evolutionary biology at Harvard University. Research interests focus on biomechanics and evolution of fishes, with a special focus on laboratory analyses of kinematics, muscle function, and hydrodynamics of freely swimming fishes. So current work involves application of analyses of fish locomotor function to the design of fish-like robotic, biorobotic test platforms. And if you're a social media participant and you do not follow hashtag SharkScaleSaturday, you definitely need to, because these posts contain amazing visuals coupled with some rich information. So I would like to take this time to go ahead and turn it over. I will be standing by. If you have any questions or anything, please go ahead and use the group chat on the side. We will let George go ahead and share all this wonder and amazement that he is going to, and then we'll take some questions and answers. And for our viewers at home, if you do not have a camera spot, please feel free to go ahead and send us questions, and hopefully I will get to see them and go ahead and send them over. So without further ado, if you want to go ahead and take yourself off mute, George, and it is yours. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you today. My lab here at Harvard works on fish swimming, how fish swim, how they move their bodies and fins to move so beautifully through the water. And one of the most amazing groups of animals, of course, are sharks. And sharks have lots of very special features that help them move through the water so nicely. And that's what I'd really like to talk to you about today, because in my laboratory here for the last several years, we've been working hard on to better understand how sharks move through the water. And that involves the structure of their skin, which is truly amazing. And so I do have some very simple slides to walk you through to show you some of the images, because the best way to understand shark skin is to look at pictures of shark skin. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. And let's see. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
And I'll go into presentation mode. So can you see my first slide here about the amazing skin of sharks?
Oh, good. Yes.
So that's great. So you've probably seen many pictures of sharks. Maybe you followed Shark Week on the Discovery Channel, or just on the internet. There are so many great pictures of sharks. And we focus so much on their head and their teeth and their biting capabilities, which are pretty extraordinary too, and some of their remarkable behaviors that sharks have, and their swimming capabilities. But today I want to tell you a little bit about their skin, because you may not have thought that much about shark skin, but it is incredible. And there are some great things we can learn about how to move through the water more effectively by studying sharks and their skin. So let's take a look at shark skin. If we zoom way in on the skin of sharks, this is what it looks like. Sharks are covered with many thousands of small scales, which are called denticles. And you can really use either term, a scale or a denticle. Usually when we talk about sharks, we think of denticles, but it doesn't really matter. And so here you can see each individual little scale and how beautifully small and complex they are. They're all layered next to one another. They form a beautiful pattern. They have ridges on them, and the sharks are covered with these. So they are not smooth. And if you feel a shark or ever have a chance to feel the skin of a shark, it will feel a little bit like sandpaper. It is interesting because it's directional sandpaper in the sense that if you move your finger from the head of the shark toward the tail, it feels pretty smooth. But then when you move back from the tail toward the head, it's a little rougher feeling, and you can feel the little ridges and the pointy parts of the individual denticles that you can see on this image. Now let's zoom in and look at one of these amazing denticles. And here's one, and you can see how it's got ridges, it's got pointy parts that point toward the tail. So in this image, the head of the shark would be to the left, and the tail of the shark would be to the right. And these things are pretty small. I did put a scale bar on here. 130 microns may not mean too much to you, but it's about the thickness of one of your hairs from your head. It's about the thickness of a human hair, or thickness of a piece of paper, for example, would be a good comparison for what these shark denticles are like. And there's a lot of variation in different species of sharks around the body of sharks, which we'll talk about in a second. But it's an amazing thing to think that sharks are swimming around in the ocean covered by these beautiful, tiny little scales that have an amazing structure that I'll tell you about in a second. So I did mention that different species of sharks differ very much in the different shapes and sizes of these little scales or denticles. Some sharks you can see here on the upper right of this slide have sort of round, so almost cap-like denticles. The shark to the left has these little sort of pointy teardrop-shaped denticles. And some of the fast-moving sharks in the ocean, like these two images from the bottom, have much smaller and overlapping scales. So the image on the lower left is from a mako shark, and the image on the lower right here is from a great white shark. So you can see how the scales are all packed in right next to one another in those fast-moving sharks. The two images at the top are from slower-moving sharks that like to sit on the bottom a lot more. So the fast-moving sharks just have more tightly packed individual denticles. And it's also true that the structure and shapes of these scales or denticles varies around the body. So let's look at some different parts of the shark. And you can see in the upper left, for example, on the nose of a shark, these denticles are all stuck together. They're smooth on top, and they're like little paving stones, all packed together like on a walkway. But on the fins to the right, you can see each little leaf-like scale sticking out from the surface. On the lower left, you can see another kind of denticle shape from the body of the shark. And then in the middle of the lower part of the slide, you can see another type of pattern of tightly packed leaf-like denticles that cover the surface of the shark. So there's just so much amazing variation from different species of sharks and different locations on the body. And I can just tell you from a research point of view, we really don't know quite what all these different shapes and sizes do for the shark. That's something that I'm very interested in, and I'll explain in just a few minutes how we're trying to study the function of these denticles and what they do. Before we get to that, there's one amazing fact that I want to tell you about shark denticles, yet another amazing fact. And that is that each one of these tiny tooth-like, tiny denticles or scales is a tooth-like structure. So they're actually very similar to your teeth So on the left-hand side of this, I've shown a cross-section of a shark scale. And you can see that there's a little tooth-like structure that sticks up. And inside that tooth-like structure is a cavity of space that receives a nerve and a blood vessel. And those cavities are covered with dentine and then enamel, which is very similar to your teeth. So on the right, you can see another view of a shark scale with enamel on the outside, dentine on the inside, and the pulp cavity underneath. And this is really just like your teeth, the teeth that are in your head. And we can compare in the next slide here. I can show you on the left is what a human tooth looks like with enamel, hard enamel coating on the outside. So if you touch your teeth and there's the hard surface that you're touching, that's what you're feeling, is that outer enamel layer. A dentine, which is a softer inner layer that supports the enamel, and then the cavity inside your tooth. Each of your teeth has a little cavity inside of it called the pulp cavity that has blood vessels and nerves. So if you do damage your teeth, you will know that, and you will feel the pain of that because there's a nerve that goes inside your tooth. And if your tooth gets broken, it will bleed a little bit because there's a blood vessel that's inside your tooth also. But the exact same structure is present on each one of those many thousands of shark scales. Each one of them has a pulp cavity, enamel on the outside like we see on the right of this slide, a dentine-like inner layer. It's just amazing that not only are sharks covered with these scales, but that each one is like your tooth. And in fact, in evolution, that's where your teeth actually come from. The genes that make up, that cause sharks to develop these scales on their surface are the same genes, only slightly modified, that produce your teeth in your head. It's an amazing, to me, still, after many years of working on this, it's an amazing biological fact. So shark denticles or scales are basically small teeth, and there are many thousands of these. Now, what are they doing for a shark? Why do sharks have all of these denticles covering their body? So there are a couple of ideas people have had as to why sharks have this. The first one, and the one we'll talk about a little bit soon, is to reduce the effort to move through the water. And I'll tell you more about that in a second, but it's thought that these shark denticles make it easier for the water to flow over the shark and make sharks move with less effort when they swim. Other suggestions have been that when predators or other animals try and bite on the sharks, it does give them some protection. And many animals in the ocean are subjected to parasites. Parasites try and latch onto them, and these denticles may help prevent parasites from attaching to the sharks. And there are some other ideas people have had too that we won't go into now, but I'd be happy to answer your questions if you have thoughts or want more information about what these denticles could be doing. But let's talk for a moment about this first point. How might these scales that cover the surface of the sharks reduce their the force that it takes for them to move through the water, which is called the drag force, the drag on the body? And certainly when you guys have been swimming, you have felt the resistance of the water to you. You try and swim faster and faster, but there's an opposing force that's caused by the water that's hard for you to move through. It's hard for you to go extremely fast. And so if there's a way to reduce the effort to swim, that would be a very effective thing to have. And we think that sharks have that with these scales. So let's think about that for a second. And I made a very simple slide here with a question for you to think about. So I'll pose the question, and then I'll wait just 15 or 20 seconds for you to think about this question and then I'll give you an answer. So my question is this: to move through the water with as little effort as possible, should you be as smooth as you can, or is it better to be rough? So on the left, we have a very smooth ball. On the right, a roughened ball. And you could imagine many different kinds of roughness on the surface. You could imagine little spikes like you see here. You could imagine all sorts of different surfaces that make the ball rough. So if you're going to move as efficiently as possible through the water, do you want to be as smooth as you can be, or do you want to be rough? So let's think about that for a few seconds. And I think that most people would tend to believe that it's much better to be as smooth as possible, to move through a fluid environment and be as streamlined and make yourself have a slick and smooth a surface as you can. But it turns out that the answer is it's actually better to be rough. But you need to have the right kind of roughness. And that's what we think sharks have with their denticles. So it might seem a little counterintuitive that you want to be rough to move through the water, but I think I can give you a common example that will help us think about this. And that is the example of a golf ball. So why do golf balls have these dimples, which I pointed out with a blue arrow, these depressions in the surface to make them rough? So if you've ever seen a golf ball, and I've got some here, I can show them when we're done with the little presentation. Golf balls are rough. They didn't always have roughness. The very first golf balls, when golf started as a sport, were smooth. But it was soon discovered that having these dimpled or roughened surface made them go twice as far when they were hit with a golf club. So here you can see a somewhat scientific slide, but we'll just think about it very generally, that explains that the dimple, the roughened surface of a golf ball, it changes the way the air flows over the ball, and it actually goes twice as far as a smooth ball. So on the top of this image, I've shown you a smooth ball, a smooth sphere, or a smooth ball, and at the bottom, a roughened ball like a golf ball. And if the air is moving over this ball, it's going from the left side of the screen over the ball to the right, both over the smooth one and over the golf ball. And you can see that there's a wake behind the golf ball and behind the smooth ball, and that the wake over the smooth ball is thicker. It's labeled thick wake, and it's narrower or thin behind the golf ball. And that's because of how the air, which is a fluid, moves over the surface of the ball, and it stays close to the surface for longer and has a thinner wake behind it, and that causes less resistance to motion. And I'm happy to go into more detail if there are questions. But I think the quick thing to take home from this is that the roughened surface reduces the drag on the ball as it moves through the air, and so it goes much farther. And so that's what we think sharks are doing with their roughened surface. So there are many attempts to imitate this. Some of you may have tried on different swimsuits. A famous swimsuit manufacturer, Speedo, has made a number of swimsuits, and they've tried to imitate shark skin, if I go back to the swimsuits here, that help swimmers move more rapidly through the water. And so we have imaged in my lab the surface of these swimsuits, which you can see here, and they are not as smooth as you might think. The Speedo swimsuits are made with a roughness that is thought to help swimmers move through the water better, and that looks somewhat, not exactly, but somewhat like the roughened surface of sharks. So you can see the fabric that they're made from here is bumpy with tight little balls of weave that make it roughened like the surface of a shark. Now, what are we trying to do in the lab? I'll wrap up here. To study shark skin, we're doing different imaging of the skin. We're 3D printing. I'll show you some pictures in a second. We're doing some robotic studies of swimming pieces of shark skin, and we're doing experiments on living sharks to image water flow. And I'll only say a few words about this just to wrap up, but I want to leave you at least with the idea that this is an active area of scientific research. There are quite a few people interested in the structure of the shark skin, in imaging it in different ways, in 3D printing models of it that we can study, and attaching it to robots, and also studying living sharks to see how the water does move over this surface. So here are some of our images. We've been making 3D models of the individual denticles. On my screen, I can see on the right-hand side an example of it spinning around. The flat, pointy part sticks out into the water, and the expanded bottom part is actually embedded in the skin of the shark. So we're doing a lot of imaging to better understand the structure of each one of these tiny tooth-like scales that sharks have. We're also 3D printing them. So here you can see little denticle shapes that we printed onto a wing-like structure, putting them on different objects to see how the flow varies as it moves over the surface, and using sort of inspiration from sharks to better design devices that we build ourselves so that they can move through the water more effectively like sharks do. And finally, we're taking pieces of shark skin. Here we are cutting a piece of skin from a shark, making it into different structures like membranes, like you see on the right-hand side, that we can study in the laboratory, and attach those to different devices. So I've shown you here, on the left is a piece of aluminum that we've glued the shark skin to, so we can attach that to a robotic system and make it swim in the laboratory. On the right is a membrane of shark skin that we can swim in our experimental setup here in the lab and study the effect of those individual scales on swimming. So I hope you can see this. I do have a movie here just showing some of our 3D printed shark skin swimming in the laboratory environment. It doesn't look much like a shark, but this is how you simplify things for a scientific study of the effect of the surface on swimming in the water. And so I'm going to wrap up here with one last movie that I hope you will be able to see, that shows our very recent results just from the last few weeks of flow, where we're imaging the water moving over the surface of these individual denticles in a living shark. And so on the right-hand side, you can see the little pokey individual denticles sticking out. On the left, you see the water that has looks kind of gray with white spots. Those are little particles we put in the water so we can image the flow. And I'll play the movie, and you can see the individual denticles move out, the water moving over it, and then they kind of collapse down and move back. And so one of the things that we were amazed to see is that sharks may be able to alter the angle of these individual scales. As you can see on the left-hand side, they fold back in. Movie will loop one more time. And I don't think we ever expected that sharks might be able to control these individual scales and maybe then alter the flow over the body. So we were pretty amazed at this, and we feel like we have a lot more work to do in the coming years to better understand how these shark skin surfaces work to help them swim better. So I think that's the last of my slides. I'm happy to talk to you and to answer questions. And I'm always excited when students become interested in sharks and how they manage to swim through the water.
Well, thank you so much for that great visuals. And I remember, like, when I started seeing your Twitters, it made me start thinking about when I was a swimmer. So We won't mention how many years ago that was. When I was swimming in college, they were talking about getting those swimsuits. So that was a big thing back then for swimming. So let's start taking some questions. So up here, we'll pull up on, we have Thornton Elementary. So come on up and we'll take 2 questions from your class. You just have to take yourself off mute.
I'm not on mute though, no. I think they're off mute, but I can't hear them.
Can you type it in? Go ahead and type in your question. Okay, so the question is, do you have to kill the shark to get the skin?
Well, it's a good question, and we don't kill the shark to get the skin, but the shark skin, in order to study it in the lab, you do need to have pieces of skin from a dead shark, but we usually get those from fish markets. So the sharks are already dead. They're caught by fishermen. I always prefer sharks to be alive and swimming around in the ocean, but we do use fish market sharks that are caught already. So they're already dead, and that's how we get our skin. And the very last movie that I showed you was on a living shark. So we right now have 5 small sharks in the lab, and they're alive, and they're doing very well, and they will stay alive.
Awesome. Awesome. What species was it?
What we have in the lab now are chain cat sharks, which are a very nice laboratory shark because they sit on the bottom and they like to pretend they're rocks. They do not swim around like a mako shark in the ocean. And so that makes it easy for us to study them.
Awesome. Thank you. So go ahead. Did you type in another question? Let's see. Go ahead and type in your question. I see the typing. What other kinds of sharks do you study?
Oh, that's a good question. So we've studied many kinds of sharks. We've studied great white sharks, their skin, mako sharks, which are the 2 probably most exciting sharks in the open ocean, but also some local sharks off the east coast of the United States here, such as the cat sharks, which sit on the bottom. Smooth dogfish and dogfish are all sharks we've studied in the lab. Bamboo sharks also. And you Google those, you'll see pictures of them, and they're quite different from each other. So we've tried to study quite a few species because they differ so much from each other.
Awesome. Thank you. So now, hi, this is Clarksville Elementary. Go ahead, come on up and ask questions.
What was the top speed of a shark?
Well, I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Top, really?
Oh, the top speed varies tremendously in different species of sharks. So mako sharks, which are probably the fastest in the ocean, might be able to go 30 miles an hour, but not for too long. So that would be a very rapid burst swimming when they're eating, typically, or getting ready to eat. But so 30 miles an hour is probably the top speed, but many of the sharks we work on are swimming much more slowly in the laboratory, even just a few miles an hour.
Awesome. Thank you. Great question. Go ahead. Come on.
Wait. Can you back up? Scoot back up, guys. Scoot over here. Look at the camera. How many gills do a shark have?
Oh, very good question. And we're very interested in that. It varies a little bit it can be between 5 and 8.
Okay.
So some of the very earliest sharks have more gills. Most of the sharks swimming around now have around 5. And those gills are housed in special chambers inside their head. And the water moves over the gills where they respire. and then out the side. And it's a fascinating process. I should just mention that many sharks actually do not have to keep swimming to breathe. That's a common myth, but mako sharks probably do. But many of the sharks that sit on the bottom are fine just passing water over their gills.
Awesome. Great question so far. So now we'll take two from Taylorsville. I think you actually have to type it in because we can't hear you. Maybe it's the mic. Can you type it in?
Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Okay. Now ask.
What is your favorite type of shark to study?
Oh, there are so many. This is like asking me what's my favorite child. I like them all. They're all just very different. So everything from the mako shark, which is really an amazing open ocean shark, to the very small cat sharks we have in the lab now that basically sit on the bottom, don't move, and think they're rocks. They're this tremendous diversity of sharks. I cannot pick my favorite because I love them all.
Okay. And that's all the questions we had.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. Any others? Okay. So thank you so much for everybody joining us. Oh, we have one question on the little chat box. Can you tell us about the facilities,
Go ahead and go.
the aquariums you have?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, so we do have some big saltwater tanks. We're here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so we're not right by the ocean. So we have big saltwater tanks with sharks that we hold them in and feed them in, and they live very happily there. And then study the swimming. We have some big, it's like a big fish treadmill where water moves past the fish and the fish swim against the current and basically stay in place, just like you walking on a treadmill. So we can study them, and we use high-speed cameras. Like the very last movie I showed you is a very expensive camera that we use to image the flow over the shark and then the motion of the body and the fins. So a lot of the facilities are sort of scientific facilities that we use to study the movement, but we do have a bunch of different aquaria that are pretty large that can hold small sharks, but we can't hold the very most, like the mako shark or a great white shark. We can't have. One thing I should mention, and you can Google us, is Harvard has a very famous museum, a Museum of Comparative Zoology here. And that is an important facility for us. Behind the scenes in the museum here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, are 1.5 million specimens of fish. A lot of fish. And they've been collected over many, many years. And if you're ever in the Cambridge area, you should please come by and visit.
Awesome. Well, I think we are losing some people because of lunch. I know that my tongue is growling, possibly yours. So thank you so much for joining us, and especially for all the visuals and the information. Definitely check out the website, follow along on Twitter and social media. And on behalf of Sharks for Kids, thank you so much, George, for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.